Got my heart now about to explode. I'm about to explode. Feel good, what I'm feeling.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Ignite Your TruSelf. I'm Erica Salee, speaker, author, transformation success coach, and your host for this evening's show. Now, I do realize that you may be watching this and it may be evening, or you might be watching it during the morning time, the afternoon, but whatever time you happen to see this, I do believe it will be the right time. So welcome to the conversation. For those of you who are here for the first time, let me take a really brief moment to introduce myself as a speaker, self-help author, and transformation success coach. I do help my clients to figure out what stands in the way of their success. And of course, those are women and organizations who are ready to take their lives to the next best level, moving some of the things out of the way that often hold us back from being the best version of ourselves for ourselves, and then being able to serve with that best version, our gifts and all the things that we bring to the table to make the world a better place. And so tonight's conversation on Ignite Your TruSelf is one of many. If you have not had an opportunity to check out the previous week's shows, and I do encourage you to go to my YouTube channel, go up to the top part of the page or the channel, and you can check out all the shows underneath of the live button right there on my YouTube page. But these are conversations that I love to bring to you to help enlighten you as to what might be holding you back, and then giving you some nuggets, some tips, some tidbits to think about to give you just enough of a spark to keep you moving forward so that you can move to your next. So before we get started with tonight's conversation, I do want to encourage you to use the hashtag Ignite Your TruSelf so that your community, your tribe can know what you are up to on this Thursday evening. So again, use the hashtag Ignite Your TruSelf. And I don't want to go any further without first acknowledging the fact there she is. Good to see you on with me live. Miss Jaquista, thank you so much for joining the conversation this evening as always. But I do want to also acknowledge that, yes, this is Women's History Month. Now listen, every week during this month, I'm going to be just having a brief conversation. I mean, we are so amazing. We are so dope. We are doing so many things. I mean, we are making strides everywhere, in homes, in businesses, in personal development, in technology, in sports, in media, entertainment, science, you name it, we are there. And so I just want to give a big shout out to the rest of the women who occupy this space with me. And that space is called Dope. Wherever we are, whatever we do, whoever we are connected to. And I know some of us are still trying to figure out what that looks like, but just the fact that you are still here means that you are still part of the movement. And we are making strides. We are putting our fingerprint and our footprint in so many different areas that make this world go round. I know. We still trying to make sure that people understand that and acknowledge us for that. We have come a long way. We have done a lot of amazing things, and we still have a lot left to do. So just wanted to get that in there because it's important for us to acknowledge that. I could probably spend this show, the next show, and every other show talking about the amazing accomplishments that women have done and continue to do, and really the difference that we make when it comes to being change makers and moving the needle and advancing things so that this world that we live in can be a better place. So shout out to all the ladies who are doing it and doing it well. So let's get into this topic for tonight. So tonight's topic is, what old stories do you keep telling yourself? Now, I know that's a mouthful, but I want to say that again. What old stories do you keep telling yourself? Now, here's the thing. Have you ever stopped to like listen to your thoughts, right? Like, you could be in the middle of doing something, or you could be sitting still and really just kind of being in a place where you don't have a lot going on. And if you stop to like listen to what's going on in your head and what then transpires out of your mouth as a result of those thoughts, sometimes when we just really stop and think about that, there's one thing that comes to mind, and that is, ooh, are we self-sabotaging because we're holding on to some old stories, some things that we are telling ourselves that influence our thoughts, that influence the way we speak, and that influences how we act? So I'm going to ask you that question. And if you can relate to that, I want you to put it in the comments and say, yep, sometimes when I stop and I think about what I'm thinking about, oh, it's a little scary at times. It makes me scratch my head. It makes me question. It makes me doubt. We're going to get into that in just a few moments. So if you really stop to think about that, that is part of the problem when we say, okay, what are some of the old stories that I'm telling myself? And I'm going to share some of the things that might sound familiar. And I know they've been familiar to me, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who can attest to what some of these stories sound like. So why is it a problem for us to self-sabotage or to hold on to old things that may be playing over and over and over in our minds? I have a tendency nowadays to DVR the shows that I like to watch, especially the shows that come on like regular TV, stuff that's not on Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime and all those. So a lot of times when I go back and I look at the DVR, there's two things that might happen. One, I might fall asleep and I might have to rewind. Or two, if I want to go back and like look at something again, I'll rewind. So how often are we rewinding and replaying old stories that we may be holding on to from our childhood, holding on to from yesterday, last week, last year? Somebody said, somebody did, and we are still running that through our mind. Okay. So the problem with that is that when we do that, it then gets in the way of what we can see as possibilities. And it really makes it difficult for us to move beyond that story, right? And so that we can see whatever better or whatever best or whatever next looks like for us. Okay. So again, if that's something that sounds familiar, and even as I'm going to read a couple of these sample stories so that this might sound familiar. And if it does, I do want you to type in the comments because, as I said a couple minutes ago, we all have something that we have navigated through, we've dealt with, we've had conversations with people, we've had experiences, we've been taught certain things. And so these are how these stories are developed. So put it in the comments if any of these sounds familiar. Number one, I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. Number two, I'm not smart enough. Number three, I don't have enough experience. Number four, I'll never be able to, and you get to fill in the blank. You might say, I'll never be able to get another job. I'll never be able to have a fulfilling relationship. I'll never be able to sustain myself financially. I'll never be able to travel or to go on a vacation. Like, fill in the blanks. It happens for other people, but not me. Like, oh, they get to achieve success, but no, that really won't happen for me. I'm sure that won't happen for me. I'll never be able to afford that. If that's a story or any of those stories or all of those stories sounds familiar, then just let me know that I'm not by myself. So Jaquisa says, uh-oh, I'm already excited about this week. Though she says 1, 2, and 3. Yep. So the 1, 2, and 3, I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I don't have enough experience. So let me elaborate a little bit more on how these stories are formed. Okay. So, I'm going to give you a couple of examples. when we think about the families that we come from and what we've been taught, the experiences that we have, that's really how these stories are formed. So here's an example, and there's so many different examples to use. So I'm going to hit on a couple of them just so that you can kind of see where they come from. Because here's what I believe. And one of the things that I say as I'm doing my own personal development, as I'm sharing with my clients, is that we don't just wake up and just happen to be who we are or just happen to show up the way that we do. Most of what we bring to the table comes with some history. And in some cases, lots of cases, comes with some baggage. So here's how some of the stories are formulated. One of the things that I've been very vocal about, and especially in this new year, really kind of putting it out there, is that I am an advocate for, I am one who practices therapy. I say practice. I should say I use therapy as a form of my own self-care, meaning I have a therapist and I have regular sessions. Okay. However, one of the stories that has been prevalent in my culture is we Black people, African Americans, we just don't do therapy. Like what goes on in the house stays in the house. And so why would you go have a conversation with somebody? Why would you go sit on somebody's couch when you could just keep it in the family, or you can just pray it away? Just take it to the Lord in prayer and it'll be okay. All right. So that's a story because that's what history and culture says. So as a result of that story, a lot of people are sitting in spaces mentally, physically, spiritually that they may not necessarily have to be in if they would release that story and understand that there's something different that can be created. Okay. And I want to make sure that I don't get ahead of myself because that's one of the topics or one of the tips that I want to share. But that's how a story is created. All right. So you've got family history, you've got culture. Another story that may be created comes from experience. One of the things that I can attest to is that the I'm not smart enough, or if I open my mouth, I've created this story that if I say something and I say it wrong, then I'm going to be looked at as someone who's not intelligent, who's not capable of, who just doesn't have the smarts. Here's how that story was formulated. I've shared this multiple times. I talk about it in my book. I've talked about it in different platforms. But when I was in middle school, I remember us reading a book and everybody had to go around the room and read a different paragraph. Came time for me to read my paragraph, and the word in the paragraph was balcony, balcony. When I read it, I pronounced it incorrectly. I read it as balcony, and the class laughed and they laughed and they laughed. And so I was embarrassed by that. So the story that I created as a result of that experience was that, oh my gosh, I'm not as smart as the rest of the people in the class because nobody else messed up their words except me. So when we begin to think about the different things that go on in our life and the things that we go through, we start to develop. It's almost like as a child or as a baby begins to grow, and they start to develop in ways that represent the environment that they're in. And so this is like that. So we start to have these stories that we've created because of the things that we've been through, because of the things that or the people that we've been connected to. Let's say you've been in a bad relationship, and in that relationship has been toxic. Now, this doesn't have to necessarily be an intimate relationship with a spouse or companion. It could be a friendship. It could be a parent. It could be another relative or whomever. And it's just a toxic relationship. It might be, someone who has constantly put you down, or someone who has never supported you, or, someone who is only looking out for themselves. That's an experience with a person or group of people that you may have had. So you begin to create stories that say to you, oh, if I have been in this toxic relationship, then that means there must be something wrong with me. Or when I get out of the toxic relationship, then I'm not worthy of something that's better than what I've come from. And so then we kind of lean toward more of the same because of a story that we're telling ourselves. Okay. So just wanted to paint a couple of examples of how that might show up. So when we think about what we've been taught growing up and those experiences that we've had, this brings me to the first tip that I want to share with you this evening. And I also think about the fact that when I was growing up, I come from a loving family. My mother, my grandmother, my cousins, my aunts. Just remember having some really good experiences growing up. Some experiences were challenging as well. But one of the things that I do not recall is us traveling a lot. There's one trip in particular, and my grandmother and I were just talking about this a couple weeks ago. She's 95 years old. God bless. She's still alive. She still lives on her own. And we had this conversation, and she said, do you remember that time? And she always asks this question. There's something on my laptop here. She always asks this question. So I kind of marvel at it when she brings it up, because it's like, do you remember that time? And I'm like, yep, I sure do. And I always know where she's going when she starts off that way. But anyway, so she says, do you remember that time when I took you and Veronica, who is a dear cousin of mine, to Canada? And so that is probably the only trip. I take that back. That and one other trip when I got much, much older to Connecticut with my mom and one of her good friends. But anyway, so I remember that trip going to Canada. But aside from that, we never went on vacations. And, part of it was the fact that, we couldn't afford to go on vacations and money was tight. And so going on vacation was like the last thing on our mind. We would do day trips to the beach. And hanging out at my favorite auntie's house was like a vacation because, it was just a hangout spot. But actually going away, taking a long drive somewhere, staying in hotels, flying somewhere, that wasn't something that I was accustomed to growing up. So the first tip is to recognize that the stories that we tell ourselves may be tied to old history. Okay. So the old history in the example that I just gave in terms of not traveling, not having vacations, can then stem or morph into how I show up in the world in older years. Okay. And what might happen is, because the story that I may be telling myself from that example says, oh, well, you never went on vacations, which means you couldn't afford to go on vacations then. So therefore now you can't afford to go on vacation. So those stories begin to create a precedent for us, and in some cases becomes the blueprint for how we show up in the world, even as we get much older and we have new experiences. So the first thing to remember about the stories that we're telling ourselves is to recognize that those stories are most certainly tied to old history. And I just gave you a couple of examples. So when you start thinking about and you sit with your thoughts and some of your words, it's like, oh, that's tied to old history. The fact that if I were to say today, you know what, I can't afford to take a vacation, that's tied to old history. Now, sometimes you might say, well, my money is looking a little different. It's looking a little. So there's lots of ways to maneuver around that. And I think I'm getting ahead of myself. So let me slow down a little bit. But just those thoughts, just to know, it's like, okay, what is it that I'm saying to myself? One, and where is that coming from? This is what this tip is suggesting, is that when we start thinking about and kind of really taking the time to be present with our thoughts and with our words and how we're thinking, how we're feeling, what we're emitting, like the kind of energy that we're putting out, it is recognizing that, this is something old. This might be connected to something that happened to me in the past. This might be something connected to what I was taught. This might be connected to something, even down to, here's another thing. When I was growing up, one of the things that was a no-no was that we could not at a certain age, like probably I would say all through middle school, maybe even in high school, a no-no was that we couldn't wear red nail polish. Now, I don't know if black nail polish was such a big thing back in the day, but red nail polish was a no-no. So the story, even when I got older and I started to I was an adult thinking, oh, should I wear red nail polish? Because that might be a little, because it was coming from a story that I was telling myself. I was told that no, young girls don't wear red nail polish because it signifies, something about her as a woman. And maybe she's giving off the wrong message about who she is and what she brings to the table because she's wearing red nail polish and she might be considered as a flame. Okay. So if I continue on with that story, then I would go on thinking, okay, there's something wrong if I wear red nail polish. And so we get tripped up in all the perspectives around what those stories tell us and how it causes us to act. All right. So first tip is recognize that yes, those stories are most certainly, in most cases, I would say 99.9% tied to some kind of history, either experience, person, culture, teaching, and what have you. Okay. So let's move on to tip number 2. And again, this is all around this, what old stories are we telling ourselves? And even as I'm having this conversation with you, I want you to think about which one of those stories I've read earlier at the beginning of the conversation pertain to you. And you might even be thinking about some stories that I didn't even bring up. And I'm sure that's the case because we've had so many experiences. People go through different things. And so there's probably even more that you're thinking about right now. Like, oh yeah, that was a story. That was a story. What am I still saying to myself? How is this playing into who I am and what I bring to the table? Okay, so let's move on. So here's the second thing. When you start telling yourself a story, right? You know what? I can't wear red nail polish. Well, why can't I wear red nail polish? The second tip says to ask how the story is serving you now. All right. So remember when I said 99.9% of the things that go on, in our head come from some place. And while it may have made sense, and I'm using air quotes, at some point or another, or while in the moment of that development of that story, it may have felt like this is just in the moment. But now, fast forward past the moment, past the conversation, past the teaching where those stories have formulated. The question is, well, how is this story serving me right now? Like, really, is this helping me? Is it hindering me? Is it causing me to not show up as my best self? Is it causing me to not use my voice? Is it causing me to shrink back? Is it causing me not to be confident in who I am? Like, really asking ourselves, how does this serve me? One of the other stories that developed for me was it's not okay to sing at the table. And I think I've shared this conversation in other forums, because the story that I was told growing up was that if you sing at the table, it's disrespectful, it's rude. I remember very vividly sitting at my kitchen table just across the wall here on the other side of my office. And my daughter started to sing. She was probably, oh gosh, she had to be like middle school. I'm going to say sixth or seventh grade. And she started to sing, but she was singing. It wasn't like a loud, it was just like a soft, just one liner. And I said, don't sing at the table. And she was like, well, why can't I sing at the table? And she didn't say it disrespectfully, but she asked the question. And in that moment, I was like, well, why can't she sing at the table? Because I was taught that, and the story that I created as a result was, well, it's rude. And really the reality of it is that it wasn't rude at all. As a matter of fact, it was like a really nice addition to us having dinner because it was very soft, it was melodious, and she has a beautiful voice. So when we start reacting, the question is, and I literally had to say after the fact, I'm like, well, does that really make sense? Like, what's wrong with singing at the table? Like, who is that hurting? What harm is it bringing? So I had to ask myself, and I remember saying, oh, I remember, and my grandmother saying, you don't sing at the table. That was what we were taught. So I had to say to myself, well, how is that really serving anybody right now? Does it really make sense to carry that into the next generation and have my daughter traumatized and traumatize it in a light way, with the fact that she wasn't allowed to sing at the table? So then she begins to create that story and carry that into another generation. So ask the question, how is this serving me? So first of all, and I want to go back to this, first of all, is recognizing that the stories that we may be connected to are tied to old history. The things that we're telling ourselves may be tied to old history, right? So if you say one of the sample stories is, well, you know what? I'm telling myself I'm not good enough because 5-10 years ago when I was in a relationship with someone, they always put me down, always told me that I could never do anything right, so therefore I must not be good enough. Okay, so if you look at this tip and you say, okay, that's tied to old history, an old relationship that I'm no longer in, that no longer serves me, so I'm gone, but yet I'm still telling myself that same story. So when you then move to this tip, ask yourself, well, how is this story serving me now? I'm no longer in that relationship. I'm no longer with that person. I've let go of the toxicity just by detaching myself from this person, but I'm still holding on to the story, which is toxic, which causes me to think some kind of way about myself. So now this tip says, well, wait a minute. If I'm no longer in that situation, why am I still carrying this story around? And how is that serving me? One, for me to think confidently about myself, and then two, to show up in the next relationship. Number one, looking for the right relationship that honors me and lets me know my value, and that allows me to show up in that space fully, confidently in that good space. Right? Does that make sense? So if you're following me, just put a message in the comments. Let me know that you're still here. So Jaquisa saying, yep, it's all me, talking about the stories. Again, what stories are we telling ourselves? And, let's just be honest. We all have something or some things that cause us to kind of stay in that old. Okay. So number two is very important because it's a pivot point. It allows you to kind of, take back or pause before you allow that story to stop you from moving forward, or to start more self-doubt, more self-sabotage. Okay, so number two is probably important out of all the three tips that I'm going to share tonight, because it's an opportunity to say, wait a minute, hold up, let me think about this. Like, really, should I be thinking about this? One of the things that I will share that my therapist shared with me a few sessions ago, and that is, when your mind starts to go into a place, how sometimes we can take one situation, we could take one thought or something that somebody says, and we start spiraling into creating a story about something if we don't have all the facts. And that's very dangerous for a number of reasons. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of it tonight, but it's connected to what we're saying here. Her strategy was to stop and say, what is it that's showing up for me right now? Like, if I'm thinking this particular thought right now, what is this? Where is it coming from? Why am I thinking it? That's sort of what step number two is connected to ask yourself, how is this story serving me? It gives you a chance to stop, to reflect, to pivot, to make better choices, make the best decisions that you could possibly make based on the current situation and not the story that may be driving you to something else. Okay, so let's move on to tip number three. And again, conversation topic: what old stories am I still telling myself? Do I keep saying over and over and over and allowing it to play constantly in my mind and influencing my decisions. Tip number 3 is to shift the old story and create a new story. Now, there are some things that you might say, okay, if there's something that I was taught, then maybe in that moment it served me well. Okay. I'm going to go back to the red nail polish. There's a lot of history around how young girls were treated and approached by older men. Okay. I have my own experience with that. That's a topic for another day. But the fact that an adult would say to a young girl not to wear red nail polish in the moment may have served well because it may have been used as a protection mechanism, okay? Not so much as a direct punishment for the sake of nail polish and the color, okay? So we really have to say to ourselves, some stories may have served us well because it was a part of our learning and growing and shaping us and really allowing our inner circle, family, friends, to cultivate and help us given the best tools that they had available. Okay. But there comes a moment in this tip here where we say, okay, while that had its purpose, it's time to shift away from that. It's time to shift away from the old story of, oh my gosh, I was in middle school and I read that word incorrectly and people laughed at me and I felt horrible and I felt like I wasn't smart and I felt like I'm not as good as everybody else in the class. Yes, that happened. And I tell the story only to say that I had to shift away from thinking that about myself and recognizing that there's something very special, very unique about who I am and who I was created to be. All right. Here's another example. So when I first started my coaching practice, I was nervous and I wasn't really sure how to go about, this whole pricing structure. I've talked about this too. And I think it fits here to bring up again. And so in my head, the story that I was telling myself was that, well, I'm new to the industry and I'm just getting my feet wet and I'm just putting myself out there. So I should just charge this minimal fee for one of my introductory programs. And that's the story I was telling myself. What I was really saying was that I didn't really value what I brought to the table. Now, I didn't know that until I had a conversation with someone who helped me to implement tip number 3. And actually, just hold it for a second. This is live and the doorbell's ringing, so I'll be right back. That's okay. That's all right. Listen, live is live. So let me just take a look at the comments really quickly. So Jaquisa says, I feel, and then I'll go back to my connection to that story. I feel as though I'm constantly battling the negativity that was given for the purposes of making me think I can't succeed on my own. I'm doing things on my own and not allowing others to help. Got you. Okay, so I'm glad you brought that up, Jaquisa, and I do want to acknowledge you for that because it's interesting when you think about how that's showing up for you right now. Like if the experience that you had or the messaging that you got at whatever point, whether it's from family, friends, coworkers, or what have you, would suggest that, well, you don't need help. You can do it on your own. And while there are many things that we can do on our own, that story plays over and over and over in our minds. So now you keep using that story to prevent you from asking for help or letting people in who want to help, because it probably feels a little burdensome. There's another story of my own just came up about that. So let me go back to tying this tip number 3, shifting the old story and creating a new story. So what I was saying was that I had created a story that I was not valuable enough to put a different value on my services. Okay. So I had a conversation with someone that I admire, I respected. We went to graduate school together. We happened to cross paths in circles at a conference. And so we decided to have dinner after the conference was over. So we're sitting at the dinner table, and she's like, oh, tell me about your practice, tell me about your programs. And so she asked me specifically, well, how much are you charging for your service? And so I told her, and it's a wonder she didn't like spit her food out of her mouth. I'm not sure what's happening right now. The ring is going off, and I'm just going to keep going with the flow. So you all have to really just hang with me as we wrap up the conversation. Okay. Anyway, this is fun. This is fun. It is what it is. So let me go back and say this as we wrap up this conversation. There's a whole lot going on, but it's all good. So she said to me, you've created this idea that you are not valuable based on the fact that you are just starting out. But the reality of it is there's so many things that you have to take into consideration, not just years of experience, but you have to take into consideration that you have 2 degrees, you have a wealth of experience, you have corporate experience, you have your own personal stories that are woven into what you bring to the table collectively as you offer your services. So it's not just about years of experience. In that moment, I had to undo the story that I was telling myself. And that conversation caused me to create a new story. It caused me to shift myself out of what I was saying to myself. Like I really was saying, I'm not good enough to charge this because I don't have this, but then I had all these other things. So you may be sitting there with the same idea, with the same stories that you created in your head about not being good enough. I don't have enough to bring to the table. But if you look at the whole breadth and depth of who you are, what you've done over the course of X amount of years, you might just be able to use that to shift the old story and create something new. Okay, so that's just one example of how that might show up. So as we start to wrap up the conversation for tonight, I do want you to put it in the comments if there was something that stood out for you, an aha moment, or maybe some revelation about, oh, you know what? Here's another story that I've been telling myself over and over and over. And now I realize that tip number 3 is where I can start from this point on to start to make a shift. It's all about transformation and moving into what's going to align you with the best version of yourself. And so you might be saying to yourself, well, how does this help me to ignite my true self? Like this whole conversation about, what stories do you keep telling yourself? Like, how does that connect me to my true self? And for those of you who may be here for the first time, that true self, what that really means, it is someone who has tapped into their authentic self, someone who has tapped into the purpose and really living fulfilled and feeling like you're no longer going to shrink back to appease other people, but you're really coming into what feels good for you and what allows you to show up in the best way for the people that you get to serve in whatever capacity that is, because we all have different things that we've been called to do and different gifts and abilities that we get to use. So your true self is connected to allowing you to walk in that confidently, boldly, brilliantly, and all the things, right? So when you start to dismantle these stories and you start to really take tip number 3 to heart and you begin to create something new, that's when you're really moving yourself toward, well, what does that true self look like? Because if I'm holding on to old stuff, old stories, old things that I've been told, I've been taught, then that really may not be serving me because it's no longer applicable to where I am right now in life and where I want to go from this point forward. All right. So that's how, you know, this all ties in to the whole idea of your true self. And so here's one of the things that I also want to mention as we wrap up. So there's a couple things, you know, oftentimes, and because this is Women's History Month, I think this is important to say here, is that as women, we sometimes are holding on to a whole lot of old stuff. And when we do that, we are really not stepping into the fullness of, you know, all the things and all the ways that we make a difference. Like we have such a blueprint and imprint on just about everything. But if we're telling ourselves we're not good enough, we don't have the confidence to sit in the rooms and occupy the spaces that we're in, it really becomes a hindrance to us like bringing our full selves to the table. And so I want to invite you to be a part of one of 2 information sessions that I'm hosting for the Bold, Brilliant Boss Leaders program. This is for female leaders. Now, you might say, oh, female leaders, well, that doesn't pertain to me because I don't have this title. At the end of the day, we are all leaders in our own right. So whether you are CEO of your company, you're a business owner, small business owner, whether you are a director, EVP, SVP, senior vice president, executive vice president, you might be chairman of a board, you might be chairman of your child's, sports team, you might be rallying your neighborhood and community leaders, whatever capacity. But sometimes we don't bring our full selves into those leadership roles because we're holding on to some old stuff. If that sounds like you, then I'm going to invite you to register for one of the information sessions where I get to talk about this particular program, which is designed so that you can get rid of some of those old stories. And it's also designed to incorporate another aspect that we often tell ourselves and we're misled by, and that is, it's selfish for me to honor myself, to take care of myself, to nurture myself because I'm supposed to do for everybody else. So there's lots of conversation about that in this program. So there's 2 information sessions that I'm holding. One is March the 21st, Tuesday, March the 21st from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The second is Wednesday, March the 22nd from 12 to 1 p.m. So, if the evening time doesn't work, and maybe you can carve out some time to learn something about, the benefit that this can bring to you at lunchtime or within that 12 to 1 hour, then I do encourage you to register for that session. So again, 2 sessions available. It's an opportunity for you to hear about the program. There is no commitment other than that hour that you're giving up. And then you get to decide once I share the information, if this is something that will benefit you so that you can move forward into your best version, so that you can move forward and really stand out and say, listen, I'm going to stand up, be bold, be the woman that I was supposed to be, and I'm going to make the difference that I was supposed to make in this world, whatever that looks like for you. Okay. So again, 2 information sessions. I'm going to post the links for you to register after this is over so that you'll have that. And then the last thing that I will say is this. is that if you say to yourself, okay, there's a lot of stuff that I heard tonight, a lot of stuff that I've heard in other sessions or other episodes of Ignite Your True Self. I've got some questions as it pertains to me, what I'm trying to do for myself, how to move forward, how to apply this to me personally. Then I do invite you to go to my website, trusynergy.org. At the top of the page, there's an opportunity for you to contact me, and we can set up a one-on-one discovery session to talk specifically about what relates to you and how to pull all this together so that you can figure out how to keep moving forward into your next. So trusynergy.org. You can also check out my link tree, True Synergy _ that gives you connections to all of my social media. I am Erica Salee on YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and then True Synergy _ on Instagram. So you can find all of that on my Linktree address as well. So with that being said, we are wrapping up for tonight's episode. Next week, we're going to be talking about what I am done putting up with. What I'm done putting up with. I think that'll be a good extension from tonight's conversation. So I'm going to invite you to join me on next Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, again, right here on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And of course, if you're watching this on YouTube, I do invite you to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell so that you get announcements of when new videos are uploaded, and then share it out with your community as well. So again, next week, the question we'll tackle is what I'm done putting up with. Actually, that might be a statement or a question. So, but join me next week nonetheless. So on that note, I'm excited that you spent some time with me on this evening. I look forward to seeing you all again real soon. Until I do, take care of yourselves, and yes, be well.